Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are on Chapter 6 entitled Heroic Politics, and we begin with paragraph 634. All the historians date the beginning of the heroic age from the corsair raids of Minos and from Jason's naval expedition to Pontus. It continued through the Trojan War and the wanderings of the heroes, and came to an end with the return of Ulysses to Ithaca. Thus, in those times, the last of the major divinities, Neptune, must have been created. This inference we base on the authority of the historians, reinforced by philosophical reasoning, assisted by several golden passages of Homer. The philosophic reason is that the naval and nautical arts were the last inventions of the nations, since it took the flower of genius to invent them, so much so that Daedalus, their inventor, remained a symbol of genius itself, and Daedala tellus is used by Lucretius in the sense of, quote, the ingenious earth, end quote. The Homeric passages to which we refer are in the Odyssey. Whenever Ulysses makes a landing or is driven ashore by the tempest, he always mounts a hill to look inland for a trace of smoke, which will indicate the land is inhabited by men. These Homeric passages are reinforced by that golden passage in Plato, which we cited from Strabo above in the Axioms, in which he tells of the horror the first nations long had of the sea. The reason for this was pointed out by Thucydides, where he says that through fear of corsair raids, the Greek nations were slow to come down and dwell on the coasts. On this account, Neptune is portrayed to us as armed with a trident, with which he made the earth shake. The trident must have been a great hook for grappling ships. By a fine metaphor, the hook is called a tooth, and the 3 in the prefix means the superlative, as we have noted above. With this hook he made the lands of men quiver in fear of his raids. Later, already in Homer's day, he was believed to make the physical earth shake, and in this opinion Homer was followed by Plato with his abyss of waters, which he placed in the bowels of the earth, with what reason we shall show later. 635. Of such nature must have been the bull in the shape of which Jove abducts Europa, and the Minotaur or bull of Minos, by which he steals youths and maidens from the shores of Attica, on which account horns of ships survived in the sense of sails as used by Virgil. Landsmen thus set forth in all truth that the Minotaur had devoured their children, for to their horror and grief they had seen them swallowed up by the ships. Thus too the orc seeks to devour Andromeda, lashed to the rock and petrified with terror, so Latin kept the phrase terror defixus, rigid with fear, and the winged horse which Perseus rides to her rescue must have been another corsair ship, as the sails were afterwards called the wings of ships. Virgil, too, who was acquainted with these heroic antiquities, and speaking of Daedalus, inventor of ships, states that he flies with the machine which he calls alarum remigium, the orage of wings, and Daedalus, we are told, was the brother of Theseus. Thus Theseus must have been a poetic character of the Athenian youths, who, under the law of force practiced on them by Minos, are devoured by his bull or pirate ship. He is taught by Ariadne seafaring art by means of the thread of navigation to escape from the labyrinth of Daedalus, which, before those labyrinths which are the elegant playthings of royal villas, must have been the Aegean Sea, because of the great number of the islands it bathes and contains. Then, having learned the art from the Cretans, he abandoned Ariadne and returns with Phaedra, her sister, that is, with a similar art. Thus he slays the Minotaur and frees Athens from the cruel tribute imposed by Minos, which is to say, the Athenians, in their turn, took up piratical raiding. And so, as Phaedra was the sister of Ariadne, Theseus was the brother of Daedalus. 636. Apropos of these matters, Plutarch in his Life of Theseus says that the heroes considered it a great honor and added prestige to their arms to be called robbers, just as in the returned barbarian times, corsair was regarded as a title of nobility. It is said that the laws of Solon, who lived about that time, permitted associations for purposes of piracy. So well did Solon understand this complete humanity of ours, in which pirates are not protected by the natural laws of nations. What is even more astonishing is that Plato and Aristotle made robbery a species of hunting, and with these great philosophers of a most civilized nation, the ancient Germans, in their barbarism, are in agreement. For among them, according to Caesar, robbery was not only not regarded as infamous, but was reckoned among the exercises of valor, by which those who were not brought up to the practice of any art escaped from idleness. This barbarous custom endured for such a long time afterwards among the most enlightened nations, that according to Polybius, one of the terms of peace imposed by the Romans on the Carthaginians was that they were not to pass Cape Pellorum in Sicily, either for piracy or for trade. Still, the attitude of the Carthaginians and Romans is of minor importance, for they themselves professed to be barbarians in those days, as may be seen from several passages in Plautus, in which he says that he has turned the Greek comedies into a barbarous tongue, meaning Latin. What is more remarkable is that the highly civilized Greeks, in the times of their most cultivated humanity, should have practiced such a barbarous custom, which indeed provided them with almost all the subjects of their comedies. It is perhaps because of this custom, still practiced by the inhabitants against the Christians, that the coast of Africa facing us is called Barbary. 637. The principle of this oldest law of war was the inhospitality of the heroic peoples, which we have discussed above, for they looked on strangers as perpetual enemies, and rested their own reputation for power on keeping them at the greatest possible distance from their frontiers, as Tacitus tells us of the Suevi, the nation of greatest prestige among the ancient Germans. They thus looked upon strangers as robbers, as we observed not far back. There is a golden passage of Thucydides on this subject, in which he remarks that down to his time, when travelers met on land or sea, they would ask one another if they were robbers, meaning foreigners. But as the Greeks became more civilized, they soon cast aside that barbarous custom, and called barbarous all the nations that retained it. It was in this sense that the name Barbaria remained in use for the land of the troglodytes, who were supposed to kill foreigners who crossed their borders, as indeed even today there are barbarous nations in which this is the custom. It is certain that civilized nations do not allow strangers to enter without first asking permission. 638. To the nations that the Greeks called barbarous for this reason belongs the Roman. This we know from the two golden passages in the Law of the 12 Tables. One is, "Against a foreigner the right and property shall be everlasting." The other is reported by Cicero as, "If a day has been appointed, let him appear with a stranger." Here the word hostis, on the basis of a conjecture in general terms, is commonly taken as a metaphor for the adversary in the lawsuit. But on this very passage Cicero makes the observation, very much to our point, that the ancients meant by hostis what was later meant by peregrinus. These two passages taken together give us to understand that the Romans originally regarded strangers as eternal enemies at war. However, the said two passages must be understood as applying to those who were the first hostis in the world. These, as noted above, were the foreigners received into the asylums, who later took on the quality of plebeians to the formation of the heroic cities, as shown farther back. Thus, the passage in Cicero means that on the appointed day the noble shall appear with a plebeian to claim his farm for him, as we have also said above. Hence, the everlasting right of property, mentioned in the same law, must have been against the plebeians, toward whom, as we learned from Aristotle in the Axioms, the heroes swore eternal enmity. This heroic law kept the plebeians, however long in possession, from usurping any piece of Roman property, for title to such property could pass only from noble to noble. This is a good part of the reason why the law of the 12 tables did not recognize simple possession. Only later, when heroic law was beginning to fall into abeyance and human law was gaining in strength, did the praetors assist the plebeians by recognizing simple possession extra ordinem, for neither by express provision nor by any interpretation could they find in the law of the 12 tables any basis for ordinary judgments, whether strict or equitable. All this was because the law held simple possession by a plebeian to be in every case at the pleasure of the nobles. Moreover, it took no notice of the underhand or violent acts of the nobles because of that other eternal property of the first commonwealths, on which also we cited Aristotle in the Axioms, namely that they had no laws concerning private wrongs or offenses, which were left to the individuals themselves to settle by force of arms, as we shall show fully in Book 4. Among the formalities of rei vindicatio, there was a survival of this real force in the feigned force which Aulus Gellius called festicary, exercised with a straw. All this is confirmed by the interdict unda vi, granted by the praetor extra ordinem, because of the law of the 12 tables did not take cognizance of private violence, or even mention it, and also by the actions of de vi bonorum reptorum and quod metus causa, which came later and were likewise praetorian. 639. Now the heroic custom of holding strangers to be eternal enemies, which was observed by each people privately in peace, when extended abroad, took the form recognized as common to all heroic nations, of carrying on eternal wars with each other, with continual looting and raiding. Thus from the cities, which Plato tells us were born on the basis of arms, as we have seen above, and began to govern themselves in military fashion before the existence of such wars as are waged between cities, we get the term war itself, for the Greek polemos, war, is from polis, city. 640. In proof of what we have said, we must make this important observation, that the Romans extended their conquests and gained the victories they won throughout the world on the basis of 4 laws, by which they governed the plebeians at home. In the barbarian provinces, they made use of the clienteles of Romulus, sending Roman colonists into them, who took the place of the previous masters of the fields, and made laborers of them. In the civilized provinces, they applied the agrarian law of Servius Tullius, granting them monetary ownership of the fields. In Italy, they adopted the agrarian law of the 12 tables, granting them the queritary ownership enjoyed by the lands called sola italica. And to the municipals or towns which had earned better treatment, they accorded the right of connubium and the share in the consulship, which had been extended to their own plebs. 641. The eternal enmity between the first cities made declarations of war unnecessary, and indiscriminate pillaging was regarded as lawful. Inversely, when the nations had been weaned away from this barbarous custom, undeclared wars came to be regarded as piracy, no longer recognized by the natural law of the nations, called human by Ulpian. This same eternal enmity of the first peoples may also explain to us that the long time during which the Romans had waged war on the Albans is to be understood as the entire previous period in which both sides had subjected each other to the pillaging raids of which we are here speaking. Hence it is more reasonable that Horatius should have killed his sister because she was mourning the Curiatius, who had abducted her, than that she should have been married to him. For Romulus himself could not take a wife from among these same Albans. It in no way availed him that he was of the royal house of Alba, nor that he rendered his city a great service by expelling the tyrant Amulius, and restoring the legitimate king Numitor. It is well worth noting that victory or defeat in war is decided by the issue of combat between the parties principally interested. In the case of the Alban War, this lay between the 3 Horatii and the 3 Curiatii, and that of the Trojan War between Paris and Menelaus. When combat between the latter 2 was indecisive, the Greeks and Trojans carried on the war to the end. In similar fashion, in the last barbarian period, the princes would decide the quarrels of their kingdoms by personal combat, on the issue of which the fortunes of their peoples depended. Hence it is clear that Alba was the Latin Troy, and Heratia the Roman Helen, of whom the Greeks had a similar story reported by Gerard Jan Vossius in his Rhetorica. And the 10 years of the siege of Troy among the Greeks must correspond to the 10 years of the siege of Veii among the Latins. In both cases we have a finite number standing for the infinity of all preceding time, during which the cities had practiced eternal hostilities on each other. 642. For the number system, because of its extreme abstractness, was the last thing to be grasped by the nations, as in this work we set forth in another connection. When their minds had further developed, the Latins used 600 for a number beyond reckoning, just as the Italians at first said 100 and later 100 and 1,000. For the idea of the infinite can be entertained only by the mind of a philosopher. Perhaps it is on just this account that the first people said 12 to signify a large number, for such was the number assigned to the gods of the Gentes Majoris, though Varro and the Greeks counted 30,000 of them. 12 were also the labors of Hercules, which must have been countless. The Latins said there were 12 parts of the os, though it can be infinitely divided. This must have been the case also of the law of the 12 tables, because of the infinite number of laws which were subsequently from time to time inscribed on tables. 643. At the time of the Trojan War, it must have been that, in the part of Greece in which it was waged, the Greeks were called Achaeans. They had previously been called Pelasgians from Pelasgus, and one of the most ancient heroes of Greece, of whom we have spoken above. The last name, Achaeans, must then have gone on spreading through all Greece, for it lasted down to the time of Lucius Mummius, according to Pliny, even as through all later time they were called Hellenes. Thus the propagation of the name Achaeans must have led by Homer's time to the supposition that all the Greeks had been allied in that war, just as the name of Germany, according to Tacitus, spread ultimately over all that great part of Europe, which was thus known by the name of those who had crossed the Rhine, driven out the Gauls, and begun to call themselves Germans. Thus the glory of this people spread their name over Germany, as the reports of the Trojan War spread the name of the Achaeans all over Greece. For the people in the first barbarism were so far from knowing anything of alliances that not even the peoples of offended kings would deign to take up arms to avenge them, as we have observed with regard to the beginning of the Trojan War. 644. Only by understanding this nature of human civil affairs, and in no other way, can we solve the amazing problem of Spain, for she was the mother of many nations acclaimed by Cicero as most vigorous and warlike, and Caesar found it so by experience, for in all other parts of the world, in which he was everywhere victorious, he fought for the empire, but in Spain alone he fought for his life. Why then was it after the fame of Saguntum, which made Hannibal sweat for 8 months on end, though he had at his disposal, and still fresh, the entire forces of Africa, with which later, though much reduced and exhausted, he won the battle of Cannae, and came very close to holding a triumph over Rome on the very Capitoline? And after the renown of Numantia, which shook the glory of Rome, though she had already triumphed over Carthage, and perplexed the valiant and wise Scipio, the conqueror of Africa, why was it that Spain did not then unite all her peoples in an alliance to set up a world empire on the banks of the Tagus? Her failure gave occasion for the unhappy eulogium of Lucius Florus, that she realized her strength only after the whole country had been conquered part by part. Tacitus, in his life of Agricola, making the same observation of the Britons, who at that time were found to be savage fighters, uses the equally apt expression dum singuli pugnant universi vincuntur, while they fight singly all are conquered. For so long as they were not attacked, they remained like beasts within the dens of their confines, and went on living the savage and solitary life of the Cyclopes, which we have set forth above. 645. The historians have been struck by the fame of heroic naval warfare, and so blinded by it as not to take note of heroic land warfare, much less of heroic politics, by which in those times the Greeks must have governed themselves. But Thucydides, a most acute and discerning writer, has left us an item of great significance. He tells us that the heroic cities were all without walls, as Sparta continued to be in Greece, and Numantia, the Spanish Sparta in Spain. And with their arrogant and violent natures, the heroes were continually ejecting each other from their seats, as Amulius drove out Numitor, and Romulus drove out the former and restored the latter to the kingdom of Alba. So much do the genealogies of the heroic royal houses of Greece and a continuous succession of 14 Latin kings give assurance to the chronologists in their calculations of time. For in the recurrence of barbarism, when it was at its crudest in Europe, we read of nothing more varying and inconstant than the fortune of kingdoms, as we pointed out above in the notes on the chronological table. Indeed, Tacitus most knowingly indicates as much in the opening words of his Annals. The city of Rome in the beginning was held by kings. For he uses the verb for the weakest of the 3 degrees of possession distinguished by jurisconsults. 646. The conduct of civil affairs under such kingdoms is related to us by poetic history in the numerous fables that deal with contests of song, taking song in that sense of the verbs canere and cantare, in which they mean to predict, and consequently refer to heroic contest over the auspices. 647. Thus the satyr Marsyas, the monster described by Livy as secum ipsa discors, when overcome by Apollo in a contest of song, is flayed alive by the god. Note the savagery of heroic punishments. Linus, who must be a character of the plebeians, for certainly the other Linus was a poet-hero, being numbered with Amphion, Orpheus, Musaeus, and others, is slain by Apollo in a similar contest of song. In both these fables the contest is with Apollo, the god of divinity, that is, of the science of divination, or of the auspices, and we found above that he was the god of the nobility also, since the science of the auspices, as we have shown, by so many proofs, belonged to the nobles alone. 648. The sirens, who lull sailors to sleep with their song, and then cut their throats. The Sphinx, who puts riddles to travelers and slays them on their failure to find the solution. Circe, who by her enchantments turns into swine the comrades of Ulysses, so that cantare, singing, was later understood in the sense of practicing witchcraft, as in the phrase cantando rumpitur anguis, the snake is burst by the singing, whence magic in Persia must at first have meant wisdom and divination by auspices, remained with the meaning of the art of magicians, and their spells were known as incantations. All these portray the politics of the heroic cities. The sailors, travelers, and wanderers of these fables are the plebeians, who, contending with the heroes for a share in the auspices, are vanquished in the attempt and cruelly punished. 649. In the same way, Pan, the satyr, tries to seize the nymph Syrinx, famous in song, as we have said above, and finds himself embracing only reeds, and likewise Ixion, enamored of Juno, goddess of solemn nuptials, attempting to embrace her, finds only a cloud in his arms. Here the reeds signify the lightness, and the cloud the emptiness of natural marriage. Hence from the cloud the fable tells were born the centaurs, that is to say the plebeians, who are the monsters of discordant natures that Livy speaks of, who steal the brides from the Lapithae, while the latter are still celebrating their weddings. So too Midas, whom we have found above to be a plebeian, wears concealed an ass's ears, and the reeds that Pan seizes, that is, natural marriage, reveal them, just as the Roman patricians made out to their plebeians that the latter were all monsters, because they practiced marriages like those of the wild animals. 650. Vulcans, who here must also be plebeian, attempting to interfere in a contest between Jove and Juno, is precipitated from heaven by a kick of Jove and is left lame as a result of it. This must refer to a struggle by the plebeians to secure from the heroes a share in the auspices of Jove and the solemnized marriages of Juno, in which, having been worsted, they came out lamed, that is, humiliated. 651. So Paethon, of the family of Apollo, and hence regarded as a child of the sun, and attempting to drive his father's golden chariot, the cart of poetic gold, that is, grain, strays from the accustomed paths leading to the granary of the father of his family, that is, lays claim to ownership of the fields, and is precipitated from heaven. 652. Most significant of all is the fall from heaven of the apple of discord, the apple which, as we have shown above, signifies the ownership of the fields, for the first discord arose over the fields which the plebeians wanted to cultivate for themselves, and the quarrel of Venus, who must here be plebeian, with Juno, of solemn nuptials, and Minerva of authority. For apropos of the judgment of Paris, by good fortune we have a remark of Pseudo-Plutarch in his De Vita et Poesie Homeri, to the effect that the two verses toward the end of the Iliad which refer to it are not Homer's but by a later hand. 653. Atalanta, by throwing away the apples of gold, defeats her suitors in the race, just as Hercules, wrestling with Antaeus, overcomes him by lifting him into the air, as we have set forth above. The meaning here is that Atalanta first concedes to the plebeians the bonetary, and then the queritary ownership of the fields, while withholding connubium, just as the Roman patricians conceded the first agrarian laws of Servius Tullius and the second agrarian law of the 12 Tables, yet retained connubium as a prerogative of their own order in the article solemnized marriages shall be withheld from the plebs, which is a direct consequence of the article, quote, the auspices shall be withheld from the plebs, end quote. Wherefore, 3 years later, the plebs began to lay claim to connubium too, and after a heroic contest of 3 years, succeeded in winning it. 654. The suitors of Penelope invade the palace of Ulysses, that is, the kingdom of the heroes, arrogate to themselves the title of kings, devour the royal substance, having taken over the ownership of the fields, and seek to marry Penelope, claiming the right to connubium. In some versions, Penelope remains chaste, and Ulysses strings up the suitors like thrushes on a net of the sort of which the heroic Vulcan caught the plebeian Mars and Venus. That is, Ulysses binds them to cultivate the fields like the laborers of Achilles, just as Coriolanus sought to reduce the plebeians who were not satisfied with the agrarian law of Servius Tullius to the condition of the laborers of Romulus, as we have related above. Again, Ulysses fights Irus, a poor man, and kills him, which must refer to an agrarian contest in which the plebeians were devouring the substance of Ulysses. In other versions, Penelope prostitutes herself to the suitors, signifying the extension of connubium to the plebs, and gives birth to Pan, a monster of 2 discordant natures, human and bestial. This is precisely the creature secum ipsa discourse of Livy, for the Roman patricians told the plebeians that if they were to share with them the connubium of the nobles, the resulting offspring would be like Pan, a monster of 2 discordant natures brought forth by Penelope, who had prostituted herself to the plebeians. 655. From Pasiphae, who has lain with a bull, is born the Minotaur, a monster of 2 diverse natures. This story must mean that the Cretans extended connubium to foreigners, who must have come to Crete in the ship called a bull, in which, as we explained above, Minos abducted youths and maidens from Attica, and in which Jove had earlier abducted Europa. 656. The fable of Io is also to be assigned to this kind of civil history, for Jove falls in love with her, is favorable to her with his auspices, and Juno becomes jealous, with that civil jealousy explained above, with which the heroes guarded their solemn nuptials, and has her watched by Argos of the 100 eyes, that is, by the Argive fathers, each with his eye or clearing, that is, his cultivated land according to the interpretation given above. Then Mercury, who must be here a character of the mercenary plebeians, by the sound of his pipe, or rather by his singing, lulls Argos to sleep, overcomes the Argive fathers in the struggle for the auspices, by which the fortunes were sung or divined in solemn nuptials. Whereupon Io is changed into a cow and lies with the bull, with which Pasiphae had lain, and goes wandering into Egypt. that is, among those foreign Egyptians with whom Danaus had driven the Enochids from the kingdom of Argos. 657. But Hercules in his old age becomes effeminate, and spins at the behest of Iole and Omphale, that is, the heroic right to the fields falls to the plebs. The heroes called themselves virae, men, in contrast to the plebeians, and viri in Latin has the same meaning as heroes in Greek. Virgil used the word emphatically in that sense at the beginning of his Aeneid, and Horace translates the first verse of the Odyssey, Dic mihi musa virum. Viri continued among the Romans to signify husbands by solemn matrimony, magistrates, priests, and judges, for in the poetic aristocracies, solemn matrimony, magistry, priesthood, and judgeship were all confined to the heroic orders. Thus the fables relate that the heroic right to the fields was extended to the plebeians of Greece, just as the Roman patricians conceded to the plebeians the queritary right by the second agrarian law, which was fought for and won in the law of the 12 Tables, as shown above. Precisely in the same way, in the returned barbarian times, feudal goods were called goods of the lance, and allodial goods were called goods of the distaff, as we find in the laws of the Angles. Hence the royal arms of France, in signification of the Salic law which excludes women from inheriting that kingdom, are supported by 2 angels clothed in dalmatics, and armed with spears, and are adorned with the heroic motto, "The lilies do not spin." So that just as Baldus, to our good fortune, called the Salic law Ius Gentium Gallorum, or the law of the Gallic nations, so we apply the term Ius Gentium Romanorum to the law of the 12 Tables, inasmuch as it rigorously confined intestate succession to sui heredis, agnates and Gentiles. For we shall show later how little truth there is in the belief that in the early times of Rome there had existed a custom whereby daughters could succeed to their fathers ab intestato, and that this custom had passed into law in the 12 Tables. 658. Finally, Hercules breaks into a fury on being stained by the blood of the centaur Nessus, the same plebeian monster of 2 discordant natures mentioned by Livy. That is, in the midst of civil fury, he extends connubium to the plebs, and is contaminated by plebeians' blood, and so dies, even as the god Phidias, the Roman Hercules, dies with Patellian law, called de nexa. By this law, vinculum fidei victum est, the bond of faith was broken, although Livy connects it with an event occurring a decade later, but similar in substance to the event which had given occasion for the Patellian law, an event in which it was necessary that the matter of the aforesaid phrase should be put into execution and not simply decreed. Livy must have found the phrase in some ancient chronicler whom he follows with as much good faith as ignorance. For when the plebeian debtors were freed from private incarceration by their noble creditors, debtors were still constrained by judicial decisions to pay their debts, but they were released from the feudal law, the law of the Herculean knot, which had had its origin in the first asylums of the world, the bond by which Romulus had founded Rome in his asylum. It seems very likely, therefore, that the chronicler had written vinculum fidei, the bond of the god of Phidias, whom Varro asserts to have been the Roman Hercules, and that later historians, not understanding the phrase, erroneously read the word as fide. The same heroic natural law is found among the American Indians, and in our world it still obtains among the Abyssinians of Africa and the Muscovites and Tartars of Europe and Asia. It was practiced with greater mildness by the Hebrews, among whom debtors served only 7 years. 659. And, to conclude, in like manner Orpheus, the founder of Greece, with his lyre, or cord, or force, which signified the same thing as the knot of Hercules, the knot with which the Patellian law was concerned, met his death at the hands of the Bacchae, the infuriated plebs, who broke his lyre to pieces, the lyre being the law, as we have so often shown above, so that already in Homer's time the heroes were taking foreign women to wife, and bastards were coming into royal successions, showing that Greece had already begun to countenance popular liberty. 660. From all this, we must conclude that these heroic contests gave the name to the heroic period, and that in these contests many chieftains, vanquished and humbled, were obliged to take to the sea with their followers and wander in search of other lands. Some of them finally returned to their native countries, like Menelaus and Ulysses. Others settled in foreign parts, like Cecrops, Cadmus, Danaus, and Pelops, who settled in Greece. For these heroic contests had arisen many centuries earlier in Phoenicia, Egypt, and Phrygia, since civilization had begun earlier in those places. Dido must have been one of the latter sort. Fleeing from Phoenicia to escape the faction of her brother, by whom she was pursued, she settled in Carthage, which was called Punica, as if for Phoenicia. And of the Trojan refugees, after the destruction of their city, Capys stopped at Capua, Aeneas landed in Latium, and Antenor reached Padua. 661. Thus ended the wisdom of the theological poets, the sages or statesmen of the poetic age of the Greeks, such as Orpheus, Amphion, Linus, Musaeus, and others. By singing to the Greek plebs of the force of the god in the auspices, which were the praises that such poets must have sung of the gods, that is, the praises of divine providence, which it behooved them to sing, they kept the plebs in subjection to their heroic orders. In like fashion, Appius, Claudius, the grandson of the decemvir about the 300th year of Rome, as we have said elsewhere, by singing to the Roman plebeians of the force of the gods and the auspices, of which the nobles claimed to have the science, kept them in obedience to the nobles. And in the same way, Amphion, by singing to his lyre, causes the stones to move, and the walls of Thebes, which Cadmus had founded 3 centuries earlier, to arise. That is, he confirms therein the heroic state. Chapter 7. Corollaries concerning Roman antiquities, and in particular the supposedly monarchic kingship at Rome, and the supposedly popular liberty ordained by Junius Brutus. 662. The numerous parallels we have cited in human civil affairs between the Romans and the Greeks, by which we have repeatedly shown that ancient Roman history is a perpetual historic mythology of the many various and diverse fables of the Greeks, must firmly convince anyone of understanding, which is neither memory nor imagination, that from the time of the kings until the extension of the connubium to the plebs, the Roman people, the people of Mars, was composed of nobles alone. To this people of nobles, King Tullus, beginning with the case of Horatius, granted the right of persons condemned for crime by the duumvirs, or the quaestors, to appeal to the entire order. The orders alone were the heroic peoples, and the plebs were accessions to the people, as later the provinces were accessions to the conquering nations, as Grotius pointed out, and are in fact the quote-unquote other people, as Telemachus called his plebeians in the assembly we mentioned above. And hence, by virtue of an invincible metaphysical criticism of these founders of nations, we are able to uproot the error, which asserts that such a mass of base-born laborers, held as slaves, had the right from the time of Romulus to elect their kings, and have their choice ratified by the fathers. This must be an anachronism of later times, when the plebs had a part in the city, and shared in the creating of consuls, which was after the extension of connubium to the plebs by the fathers, dated back 300 years to the interregnum of Romulus. 663. Taking the word people in the sense of recent times and applying it to the earliest times of the world of the cities, because of the inability of philosophers and philologians alike to imagine such severe aristocracies, has led to misunderstandings of the word king and liberty as well. As a result, everyone has believed that the Roman kingdom was monarchic, and that the liberty ordained by Junius Brutus was popular. Jean Bodin, however, though he too falls into the common vulgar error of all preceding political theorists, that monarchies came first, then tyrannies, then popular commonwealths, and finally aristocracies, what distortions of human ideas can be and are made when true principles are lacking. Nevertheless, observing the effects of an aristocratic commonwealth and the supposedly popular liberty of ancient Rome, props up his system by distinguishing the form of a government from its administration, and asserting that that of ancient Rome was popular in form, but aristocratically administered. For all that, since the facts turned out otherwise, and even with this prop his political machinery would not stand, he was finally constrained by the force of the truth to confess with gross inconstancy that in ancient times the Roman commonwealth was aristocratic in form, as well as in administration. 664. All this is confirmed by Livy, who in his account of the setting up of 2 annual consuls by Junius Brutus openly states and avows that there was no change in the form of government. And indeed, how could a wise Brutus have done otherwise than restore the state to its pristine condition from the corruption into which it had fallen? By the institution of 2 annual consuls, says Livy, no diminution was made in the royal power, for the consuls emerged as 2 aristocratic annual kings, as indeed Cicero in his laws calls them reges annuos, of the same sort of the kings for life at Sparta, which was beyond question an aristocratic commonwealth. And the consuls, as everyone knows, were subject to recall during their period of office, just as the kings of Sparta were subject to correction by the ephors, and at the end of their year's reign could be put on trial, as Spartan kings were condemned to death by the ephors. This one passage of Livy shows both the Roman kingdom was aristocratic and that the liberty ordained by Brutus was not popular, the freedom of the people from their lords, but aristocratic, the freedom of the lords from the Tarquin tyrants. Brutus would certainly not have been able to accomplish this had it not been for the affair of the Roman Lucretia, which, being offered him, he turned to advantage, for this occasion was clothed with all the sublime circumstances necessary to arouse the plebs against the tyrant Tarquinius, who had so badly handled the nobility that Brutus found it necessary to reconstruct the Senate, depleted as it was by the execution of so many senators, Tarquinius Superbus. In doing this, he achieved by prudent consideration 2 public advantages. He strengthened the order of the nobles, which was declining, and he won the favor of the plebs, for from their body he had to choose many, and perhaps he chose the boldest, who would otherwise have opposed the reorganization of the nobility. These he caused to enter the order of the nobility, and thus he composed the city, the whole of which was at the same time divided between fathers and plebs. 665. If the precurrence of so many varied and diverse causes as we have studied from the age of Saturn onward, if the succession of so many varied and diverse effects as Bodine observes in the ancient Roman commonwealth, and if the perpetual and continuous influence of these causes on the effects as set forth by Livy are not sufficient to demonstrate that the Roman kingdom was aristocratic, and that the liberty ordained by Brutus was the liberty of the aristocracy, then we must say that the Romans, a rough and barbarous people, had a privilege from God, withheld from the Greeks, an acute and highly civilized people, who, according to Thucydides, knew nothing of their own antiquities down to the Peloponnesian War, the most illustrious time of Greece, as we observed above, in the notes on the chronological table. There, too, we showed that the same was true of the Romans down to the Second Carthaginian War, from which Livy professes to write the history of Rome with more assurance, while yet confessing ignorance of 3 circumstances, the most important in the history of that war, which we also observed there. But even if we concede such a privilege to the Romans, what survives is still but an obscure memory, a confused imagination, and so reason cannot reject the conclusions we have drawn concerning these Roman antiquities. Chapter 8. Corollary concerning the heroism of the first peoples. 666. The study of the heroic age of the early world which we have here been making leads us perforce to reflect on the heroism of the first peoples. This heroism, by the axioms which we set forth above, and which have their application here, and by the principles herein established for heroic politics, was a far different thing from what philosophers have hitherto imagined as a consequence of the matchless wisdom of the ancients, misled by the philologians with respect to those 3 undefined words, people, king, and liberty, above referred to. For they have taken the heroic peoples as also including the plebeians. They have taken the kings as monarchs, and they have taken the liberty as popular. On the other hand, they have applied to these matters three ideas proper to their own refined and learned minds. The first, that of a justice reasoned on maxims of Socratic morals. The second, that of a glory which is the fame of benefits done to the human race. And the third, the desire for immortality. By following these errors and applying these ideas, they have believed that the kings or other great personages of ancient times consecrated themselves and their families, as well as their entire patrimonies and substance, to bring happiness to the poor, who are always the majority in any city or nation. 667. Yet concerning Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes, Homer tells us of three of his qualities which were in complete contrast with the three ideas of the philosophers. As regards justice, in speaking with Hector, who proposes that the victor in the fight shall bury the vanquished, he forgets their equality of rank, and the common lot of men, two considerations which naturally induce men to recognize justice, and makes the following savage reply: When have men ever made pacts with lions? And when were wolves and lambs ever of one mind? On the contrary, if I kill you, I shall drag you naked, bound to my chariot, 3 days around the walls of Troy, as indeed he did, and finally I shall give your body to my hunting dogs to eat. This, too, he would have done if the unhappy father Priam had not himself come to ransom the corpse. And as for glory, this same Achilles, because of a personal grievance, Agamemnon having wrongfully taken his breezes from him, considers himself badly treated by gods and men alike, demands of Jove that he be restored to honor, withdraws his men from the allied army and his ships from the fleet, and allows Hector to make a slaughter of the Greeks. Thus, in defiance of the devotion that a man owes his fatherland, he insists on avenging a personal offense by the ruin of his entire nation. Indeed, he is not ashamed to rejoice with Patroclus over Hector's slaughter of the Greeks. And what is much graver, this man who carries in his heels the fate of Troy expresses the disgraceful wish to Patroclus that all, Greeks and Trojans alike, may die in the war, leaving only the two of them alive. And as for the third idea, the desire of immortality, when Achilles in the lower world is asked by Ulysses if he is content there, he answers that he would rather be the meanest slave in the land of the living. This is the hero that Homer sings of to the Greek peoples as an example of the heroic virtue, and to whom he gives the fixed epithet blameless. This epithet, if we are to give Homer credit for making the delight he gives a means of instruction, as poets are supposed to do, can be understood only as meaning a man so arrogant that, as we would say nowadays, he will not let a fly pass the end of his nose. What he preaches is thus the virtue of the punctiliousness, on which the duelists of the returned barbarian times base their entire morality, and which gave rise to the proud laws, the lofty duties, and the vindictive satisfactions of the knights errant, of whom the romancers sing. 668. As against this, let us reflect on the oath of eternal enmity which Aristotle says the heroes swore against the plebs. Let us reflect further on Roman history in the time of Roman virtue, which, according to Livy, was the time of the war against Pyrrhus, a time he acclaims in the phrase, "There was never an age more productive of virtues." Following Sallust, as quoted in St. Augustine's City of God, we may extend this period from the expulsion of the kings down to the Second Carthaginian War. What of the heroes of this time? Brutus, who consecrates his house and the persons of his 2 sons to the cause of liberty. Scaevola, who terrifies and routs the Etruscan king Porsenna by plunging his own right hand into the flames for its failure to kill him. Manlius, called the Imperious, who cuts off the head of his own son for a breach of military discipline, though it sprang from love of glory and valor, and issued in victory. Men like Curtius, who throws himself mounted and armed into the fatal abyss, and the Decii, who, father and son, sacrifice themselves to save their army. Like Fabricius and Curius, who refuse the Samnite gold and the shares of his kingdom offered them by Pyrrhus. Like Attalus Regulus, who returns to a certain and most cruel death at Carthage to preserve the sanctity of the Roman oath. What did any of them do for the poor and unhappy Roman plebs? Assuredly, they did but increase their burdens by war, plunge them deeper in the sea of usury, in order to bury them to a greater depth in the private prisons of the nobles, where they were beaten with a rod on their bare backs like abject slaves. And if anyone in this period of Roman virtue attempted to relieve the lot of the plebs with some sort of agrarian or grain law, he was accused of treason and sent to his death. Such was the fate, to take only one example, of Manlius Capitolinus, though he had saved the capital from being burned by the ferocious Senonic Gauls. Likewise in Sparta, the city of the heroes of Greece, as Rome was the city of the heroes of the world, the magnanimous King Agis, because of his attempt to relieve the poor Lacedaemonian plebs, oppressed by the usury of the nobles, by a law wiping out debts, and to aid them by another giving them testamentary rights, was strangled by order of the ephors, as before noted. As the valorous Agis was the Manlius Capitolinus of Sparta, so Manlius Capitolinus was the Agis of Rome, and on the simple suspicion of being somewhat mindful of the poor oppressed Roman plebs, he was thrown from the Tarpeian rock. So that precisely because of the nobles of the first peoples considered themselves heroes, and of a nature superior to that of their plebeians, as has been fully shown above, they were capable of such misgovernment of the poor masses of the nations. For certainly Roman history will puzzle any intelligent reader who tries to find in it any evidence of Roman virtue where there was so much arrogance, or of moderation in the midst of such avarice, or of justice or mercy where so much inequality and cruelty prevailed. 669. The only principles that can solve the enigma are of necessity the following. 670. 1. In consequence of the savage education of the giants, which we discussed above, the heroic education of the young was severe, harsh, and cruel, as in the case of the unlettered Lacedaemonians, who were the heroes of Greece. These people, in order to teach their sons to fear neither pain nor death, would beat them within an inch of their lives in the temple of Diana, so that they often fell dead in agonies of pain beneath their father's blows. This cyclopean paternal authority survived among both Greeks and Romans, permitting them to kill their innocent newborn babes, whereas the delight we now take in our young children reveals all the tenderness of our natures. 671. 2. Wives were bought with heroic dowries, a usage which survived as a solemnity in the nuptials of the Roman priests, which were contracted by mutual mock sale and spelt, bread offering. This was also the custom among the ancient Germans, according to Tacitus, and we may therefore assume the same of all the earliest barbarous peoples. Wives were maintained as a necessity of nature for the procreation of children. In other respects they were treated as slaves, as is still the custom of nations in many parts of our Old World, and almost everywhere in the New. When the wife brings the dowry, it purchases the liberty of her husband, and is a public confession on his part of inability to bear the expense of marriage, which is perhaps the reason for the many privileges which the emperors favored dowries. 672. 3. Children acquired and wives saved for the benefit of their husbands and fathers, not as nowadays just the contrary. 673. 4. Games and pleasures were strenuous, such as wrestling and racing, whence the Homeric fixed epithet of Achilles, swift-footed, and often dangerous too, such as jousting and hunting wild game, to accustom men to steel themselves and to risk and despise their lives. 674. 5. Luxury, refinement, and ease were quite unknown. 675. 6. Wars, like the ancient heroic ones, were all wars of religion, which, for the reason we have taken as the first principle of this science, made them always extremely bitter. 676. 7. Heroic enslavement was also prevalent as a consequence of such wars in which the vanquished were regarded as godless men, so that along with civil liberty, they lost natural liberty as well. Here the axiom above proposed finds application, namely that Natural liberty is fiercer in proportion as property attaches more closely to our persons, and civil servitude is clapped on with goods of fortune not necessary to life. 677. 8. Because of all this, the commonwealths were by nature aristocratic, consisting of those who were naturally strongest. They confined all civil honors to the few noble fathers. The public good was the family monarchies preserved by the fatherland. For the true fatherland, as we have often said, meant the interest of the few fathers, and hence the citizens were naturally patricians. And with such natures, customs, commonwealths, orders, and laws, the heroism of the first peoples is realized. This heroism is now by civil nature impossible, since the causes of it, which we have enumerated, have given place to their contraries, which have produced the other two kinds of civil states, free popular commonwealths and monarchies. Both of these, though the latter more than the former, we have shown above to be human. For throughout the whole period of Roman popular liberty, Cato of Utica alone was reputed a hero, and his reputation was that of a spirit of the aristocratic commonwealth, whom Pompey's fall left as head of the party of the nobility, and who, because he could not bear its humiliation by Caesar, killed himself. In the monarchies, the heroes are those who sacrifice themselves for the glory and grandeur of their sovereigns. Wherefore we must conclude that such a hero, as devotes himself to justice and the welfare of mankind, is desired by afflicted peoples, conceived by philosophers and imagined by poets, but is not included among the benefits afforded by civil nature, as covered by our axiom. 678. All we have here set forth concerning the heroism of the first peoples receives illumination and illustration from the axioms above proposed concerning Roman heroism, which will be found to apply also to the heroism of the ancient Athenians at the time when, as Thucydides, i.e. Isocrates, relates, they were governed by the stern Areopagites, an aristocratic senate, as we have seen, and to the heroism of the Spartans, who were a commonwealth of Heraclids or lords, as 1,000 proofs above have demonstrated. This is the end of Section 5 from Book 2 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will proceed to Section 6. Chapter 1 will be entitled Epitomes of Poetic History. Thank you for listening.